setting this exhibition up was to not only sort of highlight comics it was basically specifically people in this building to begin with. It wasn't kind of like, let's bring comics to the masses of Hull, because people just didn't understand what comics were, and
or could be,
or potential or anything. So I thought, well, if I get the usual kind of suspects together and sort of like get some work off them, stick them up in what is now my gallery, which is the corridor outside, and then get people along to look at them, then we can educate people about it. And because of the situation we're in, that's been a bit tricky to get people along. Having said that, the response from the people that have come into the building has just been uniformly, wow, what is this shit, man, type thing, which presents its own problem because I'm not out there all the time policing it, and I've never been one to actually have like a gallery situation whereby you have to have cards explaining what the work's about and stuff like that. Interviewing people would be a way of contextualising stuff. Not interviewing people, but just talking to people about the thing. And you've got 2 pages, but you give me 4 pages. I mean, the idea was to have 4 pages. I would have liked more. I would have liked the whole comics of everybody, but I can't. It was just the framing up of stuff.
Yeah.
But you also give me examples of stuff that I enjoy more of yours, which is your kind of like fantasy, kind of like world building stuff.
Yeah.
And just explain what you do, I guess. Really, I mean, because although I'm talking specifically about comics, I mean, what you do, like a lot of comic artists, is a lot wider than that, and I think that informs the work that you make as well, doesn't it?
I suppose so, yeah. I mean, in comics specifically, for me, I suppose, I tell kind of stories of fictional things. So even where I've done stuff that's based around factual events, say the museum comics, whether that's for Barnsley or more locally, there's always going to be a kind of a fantasy element in that, even if that fantasy element is rooted in our kind of cultural heritage of mythologies and faiths and things like that, you know, where those things cross over. So even when I did the museum project for Barnsley, and we were looking at solving a problem of talking about engagement with a museum, you know, we came up with an idea where we looked at something from the past, and we got kids to look at something from the past, the characters in the book, but we're able to fulfill a time travel element that you can't do in reality, but you can do it in the pages of the comic real easy. And it's expected almost in comic books that you can have that event happen. It's not surprising in a comic book, whereas sometimes on TV, you know, TV has a much more kind of mundane, and I mean that of the world kind of like tradition in sort of like storytelling, that we're sometimes surprised when genre TV happens, you know, and that we get time travel elements. But in comic books, it's kind of there because, you know, you have superheroes and you have monsters and you have, like, you know, people can fly and all that kind of stuff. So it's almost natural, even when you're using a comic book to tell something that's factual, that it's not surprising when something non-factual happens in it. But and that can be a tool to sort of tell a story. And I think with my other stuff, my natural kind of like stuff that I produce myself is rooted in mythology and monsters and things like that. So that's what I like to tell stories about. I'm fascinated by the way that we've used those to tell each other stories about ourselves in the past and what they mean and what monsters are. And I love the idea that monster itself, the word, means a lesson.
Right.
You know, and so for me, that's what they are. And in stories that you tell, that they're there as a poignant thing that points to something that you should know. Yes, lessons that a lot of people are forgetting from history, which...
segues, not that I was segueing in anything. In fact, I'm probably going to knock my iPad over. It's this thing that I got from a charity shop, and my friend Douglas, who will never watch this probably, has already got this. But it's I've just been recently reacquainting myself with folk horror.
Oh,
and Douglas put me onto this 3-hour documentary on Netflix, which is really cool. It just takes you through the whole kind of history.
I think I have. What's it look like without the dust jacket?
It's pretty mad. It's like,
Yeah, I own this book.
yeah, it's brilliant.
I just don't have the dust jacket.
Yeah, it's brilliant, and I've kind of
It's really good.
I've just been working my way through it again in light of I'm doing a kind of I'm going to be doing a project for someone that it involves not monsters, creatures. It's a more generic thing, and I kind of like forget all this shit, and that's why I always really enjoy talking to you about it, because obviously you're very deeply rooted in that kind of that is your world that you occupy, and I don't even know about kind of like tabletop gaming or anything in that respect.
Yeah, well, that's something that I'm enjoying, both as a leisure activity and now kind of tentatively kind of making inroads into with my art. I mean, it's always been something that's there. You know, I remember as a kid sort of like being fascinated by, you know, the worlds that Boris Vallejo created and Frank Frazetta, and then buying those first sort of like cheap copies of Conan paperbacks from the 60s and stuff like that, with Frazetta's work on the front and some other, you know, artists on the front there. But always that those kind of things dominated, and then, you know, you find 2000 AD and people like Bisley and that are recreating those kind of Frazetta kind of like artworks and everything in a new way and in a much more kind of, I suppose, punk rock visceral way and things like that. And you find that, oh God, there's even more stuff, and Nemesis the Warlock and all that kind of stuff, and just all that kind of cool stuff. That's where I started, I suppose, looking for things. But it's even earlier than that. I mean, Clash of the Titans and, you know, all the kind of Ray Harryhausen monster flicks and stuff like that, you know. And I remember poring over as a kid sort of like a big blue dust jacketless book of mythology, and it had an image of Pan on the front, sort of like in gold, and it was like a really blue kind of like material cover. And in the book, 2-column set pages, it was full stories of all of the mythological people from Greece and everything like that, but not done in a kind of like a kid's abridged narrative. It was like a proper dictionary, encyclopedia type thing, and it told you the full story. So I remember reading like Bellerophon and Chimeras and, you know, all that kind of stuff, all the different, you know, the ladies of Hercules and everything like that, and just laying on the floor with your feet kicking behind you, reading all that stuff, and it's stuck. We were laughing the other day about world building and stuff like that. I was like talking to my wife, and we were laughing the other day because we put Clash of Titans on the old one, and I was thinking, my God, this really did influence me, because that clearly has turned up 3 or 4 times in different pieces of work. Wow. You know, this particular kind of type of imagery, you know, and it must have had a massive effect on me, being sort of like, you know, young when I saw it and everything like that, and those things stuck with me. And I was laughing the other day, sort of like chatting about the things that influenced me. These, like, you know, Clash of the Titans, Jason and the Argonauts, and Bagpuss.
Bagpuss, yeah.
That kind of collected Victorian madness. So in my drawings, you often see rooms just full of kind of like clutter of a collector.
That's interesting. Bagpuss actually came up in that folk horror documentary, and I think somebody was very kind of like playing fast and loose with trying to fit into it, but the kind of like weirdness of the kind of like mechanics of Bagpuss. We all both grew up with Bagpuss. It was fucking cool. But it's interesting that at such of an impressionable age, whatever an impressionable age is, it can be any age, that's having stuff that has imprinted a kind of like template on it in your brain, and that has allowed this sort of, oh God, I was going to do an air quote, creativity flow from it. I think I'm always massively kind of I'm massively jealous and also massively impressed by people that can remember stuff from childhood, and how that has actually kind of like, the work has developed from that.
In some cases, I don't think it's necessarily remembering. I think it's just imprinting. It's turned into something else, and you've probably remembered it as something much more academic. But then it was, like I said, just watching Clash of the Titans the other day, I'm like, oh wow, yeah, no, that, yes, I'm clearly a big fan of that.
I wish I could fucking remember. I wish I could remember any of the fucking shit that's influenced me. It's just, really, would you say, and this is a really mundane question, it doesn't really matter, but how long do you think you've been making comics now, would you say?
My first experience of meeting people who made comics was when I was working at the archaeology unit, so I'll have been about 18, 19, roughly that age. working at an archaeology unit in Beverley, and a guy called Ian Beck, who's did a lot of artwork locally for the museum service here. He was making his own comics. He was doing a kind of a comedy version of Beowulf, if you can imagine that, and some other things as well. Really kind of small indie comics. He had a mailing list before the internet, sending all that kind of stuff out. And that impressed me. And one of the other guys that came along to work at the archaeology unit on the training course we both ended up on, a guy called Dave Chapman, he was making his own comics as well. A4, fold together, staple it himself. Book called Drowning in Darkness, kind of like a detective goth kind of like book.
Right.
And again, I read all of his stuff and was fascinated. And we ended up going away to university, to the art school in Norwich together and sharing a place. And I guess I got the bug at some point. They introduced me back into comics. I'd read comics when I was younger. I'd been introduced to comics by my cousin from the States who brought, he lived in Canada, in Vancouver, and he used to come over maybe every couple of years with his family. And he'd bring over a selection of comics, usually Marvel comics and things like that, and some indie stuff. Comics would get dropped off at the place where my mother worked, which was Queen's Hotel in Withernsea, and the place was full of people who worked on the rigs offshore, and they were from Japan, they were from everywhere, and they would drop off comic books in the room because I was like a fixture in this hotel where everybody stayed, because during the summer when my mum was working there, I was always just a kid running around, climbing in and out of windows and sliding across the floor of the basement and stuff like that, on my knees. So the drop-off comics that I could read, some of them I shouldn't have had because, they were way out of my age range. But when I went to university, I think was probably the first time. I remember sitting down and I was trying to draw some comics, and typical kind of stuff that you started off when you first doing it. Just like I was into Ted McKeever, and so I was doing this kind of Ted McKeever-esque kind of like thing. So there was lots of like, weird, torturous ink lines and stuff.
Definitely Ted.
Yeah. And then I remember sitting down, and my mates had gone away to Strawberry Fair in Cambridge, because I was left on my own in Norwich because I'd spent all my money on beer, so I didn't have any money to travel with. And I'd said to a friend of mine, what shall I do? Let's start writing a comic, let's do something. What shall it be about? Let's make a list of things we both like, and somehow, punk bands and robots and religion ended up on the cards on this thing. And while they were all away, I did 6 pages of kind of almost comics or about a punk band getting together, what they did and what they were going to go on and do. And it was in my sketchbook, did it all out. It was sequential, certainly, and that was it. And I started to write a book about a band called Toxic Shock. And I've done some bits and pieces of those. You can find them online on my DeviantArt sites and stuff like that. So that would have been back in my second year, maybe, of university.
Wow.
And then I kind of like dabbled occasionally, but didn't really do anything with it. And it was only really, I suppose, when I moved back up to Hull that I kind of like tried it all again.
Yeah.
And
you crazy fool. Why would you do such a thing?
And it's like, I've been writing stories, I've been putting like fiction stuff out on DeviantArt and stuff like that, and then working on when BBC Writing was still a thing.
Gosh.
Yeah. And so I was putting stuff on there. And then I took a couple of things. I took a couple of things and transformed one of them into my first comic book, simply because my wife had said, we'd gone along to Thought Bubble, and she'd said, well, why haven't you got a table? And I said, because I don't have a comic book. And she said, well, you could do this. And I was like, well, okay, but I still don't have a comic book.
What year was this?
That was that 2010 or 11? I can't remember when we went down there. But whatever happened, I booked a table when we got back, and so I had a table before I had a comic.
Yeah. Well, that's a sensible,
because I essentially set myself a deadline. Didn't really have any time to work on it because I was teaching, and then basically
whole college,
yeah, and then did it during the summer. So produced it and then took it down there and put it on the table, and that was that really. And I haven't really looked back, I suppose.
Cool. Yeah. No, I mean that's the way to do it. Just like stick a ridiculous deadline in place and then try and get something ready for it. I think a lot of people that make comics have found that that's the motivator. It's you can kind of like have as many ideas as you like, as many stuff in sketchbooks. If people still use sketchbooks. I hope they do. But in the end, it's just like some stupid deadline, which is that I'm going to be caught with my pants down if I don't find something for this deadline. And you know, it can be a success or it can be a failure. That's not the point. It's
but you will have made something.
Yeah, it's a starting point, and
And I think that's it. It's just like the idea, you know, all of the advice in the world is like, you know, how do you get into comics and everything? The idea, you make one.
Make one.
Make one.
That is grand.
Because I can tell you now that, because obviously, you know, that's making stuff for yourself, and that's one thing. Self-publishing, you know, it's great, it's awesome. I love the stuff that I've done myself. But if you're thinking long-term to work with other people as well, that's the idea. That, you know, people still need to see what you've done. You need a portfolio, and you need a portfolio of sequential inside pages that have been finished, that you've completed.
It does help, doesn't it? Yeah.
Well, I think nobody wants to necessarily work. Your artwork can look fantastic, but if you've only got 2.5 pages in and quit every time on everything that you've done, you know, then maybe they're not going to want to work with you so much. And, you know, fair enough, we've all had our fair share of those as well.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But I think the idea that you've got some finished stuff out there is a great advert for people wanting to work with you.
Yeah, I mean, sort of self-motivated, self-publishing, just making your stuff, it is just massively important.
And it's good for you.
Yeah, of course.
You to see something that you've finished and completed is fucking amazing.
It's like, wow, okay.
I can do that.
I've done this, yeah. And obviously all the benefits that come from that, which is that people come up and go, yeah, this is pretty fucking awesome, or, you know,
they do that weird thing where they part with their hard-earned cash and take a thing away. You're not fully convinced that you've sorted all the typos out in yet. And that's mad. The first time that ever happens, that's worth all of the struggles.
I have this kind of like defense, which is this kind of like a mild form of dyslexia. It's just like mine have always been full of typos, and reviews have pointed this out as too, and it's like, that's fine, you know. And I've been here for like 3 years, so kind of like I was fortunate enough to meet you when I came to Hull, and there's Lily, is the third cartoonist in Hull, Lily Williams, but there's not a particularly great amount of us here.
There are others of us that are doing other things, that are doing comics. Mike Donaldson's obviously out there doing comics. He's working on Willie and the Bruins, I think, at the moment.
Really? Okay, cool.
He's based here in Hull, and I think there are others. We certainly got just across the water, and you know, not far, much further away, but here in Hull itself, like I say, I'm sure there's probably others that maybe are just happy doing their own thing and aren't necessarily want to be part of collectives and stuff like that.
But that, I mean, that is without kind of like just talking amongst ourselves, obviously. But I mean, that's a conversation we have had over the period of time, which is not trying to flush people out, but it's just very difficult, kind of.
Having society is great. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's difficult, I think, because as artists, you know, and creative people, we tend to work late. You know, we do other things sometimes during the day, and so we have unsociable hours through our own making and everything like that. So finding society is often quite difficult. I remember bumping into a bunch of illustrators, you know, when I first moved back up to Hull here, at night at an event in the middle of Queen's Gardens, and thinking, look at this is 3 illustrators stood together chatting. This is weird, and also cool. Obviously that went on to sort of like be mitigated by knowing more and more people. But that was kind of odd for me, considering that, you know, when I'd worked away, I'd been the only illustrator I knew in social situations, because in the pub there was no other illustrators in the pub that I frequented. You know, so even when I did go out to social situations, I was still solitary in terms of what it was I did that made up the majority of my being as a creative person.
It's very interesting. I mean, obviously, tonight I was talking and you waved at them to people online, and obviously that gives access. But that's great, and I mean, in many ways, that has been. The internet has been a wonderful kind of like add-on for comics, and there's probably to my mind, from my experience, has kind of been the singular most important kind of development for comics, I think. I mean, I don't know how people would function without it. But having said that...
And it's like totally external to the art.
Yes.
It's, as a form.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? I mean, fair enough, you know, we've seen people like Scott McCloud talk about, you know, digital comics and stuff like that. But for the most part, comics online are just the same as comics in print.
Yeah.
You know, there hasn't been an awful lot of expansion of it beyond taking it into near animation.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you know what I mean? His examples that he shows where the narrative can change in a dramatic way using digital, you know, the digital form, is something that's really not been explored. And I'm a big believer in the fact that even the paper version, considering how old it is,
it still has potential.
It still has potential to be expanded in ways that we haven't really fully comprehended yet. And I think it's that thing, because it's been a commercial product for a long time. You know, comics have been a commercial thing with advertising space in them, so they ain't going to change their format. You know, in a way. But now we're at a point where new people are coming in,
exactly.
You know, and new things are happening, and so we might see it expand into what it could potentially be, and in terms of storytelling as a unique medium.
I mean, just slightly about online is the fact that community again has been such an important part of the development, and for a lot of people that is the only way to actually access conversations and kind of like information.
Yeah.
But it can never replace the actual getting together with your species. And tonight was a reminder of the fact that there's a lot of people I haven't had a chance to speak to for a long time for various reasons. But it is so important to actually physically, I think, be in a space with people to discuss what we do. But equally, what you've just said, I was just thinking about, just send me off on a tangent about the fact of, of course, shit hasn't been explored, and it's just like, I was thinking about Japanese folding of paper, and I was just thinking, one sheet of paper that eventually becomes like, a 20-page comic just through the folds and stuff, but that's just paper mechanics and stuff. But I think it's very easy to sort of like dismiss kind of like what is basically a technology just because we've got this delightful thing that we call digital, and there's plenty of miles. It is that in the time that I have been here, I've watched your kind of like development, and I think there's definitely, from what I see of your work, there's a massive amount of confidence has entered it, especially when you're looking towards kind of like a more painted work.
Yeah.
And I think whether that's just because you've suddenly got to grips with kind of like using Procreate really well, and you found that that's a space that you can work in or something. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're making comic pages with it or whether you're making illustrations of stuff, but you can certainly see that there's areas that really are your areas of interest to explore, that really kind of like developed recently. I think who cares about putting a time frame on it? But I think definitely the last 2 years I've seen a really kind of like big leap with that.
I think that's probably true. I mean, there's been moments where I've noticed it, where I've had time to take time out to just focus on something. I did it a few years ago while still working. I had an opportunity of 6 weeks where I didn't have to focus on my job per se, but because I was interested in still doing that kind of job and figuring out things out that I could maybe explain to other people at some point further down the line, I just dug in and thought, what do I really know about drawing in perspective? So I just dug in and found the time to sort of like, really kind of like look at that, and looked at sort of like things way beyond sort of like, 2 and 3 point perspectives, but looking at curved sort of like perspectives for sort of like drawing vehicles and stuff like that, and showing things off, and looking at sort of like all the Scott Robertson techniques and everything, all the stuff that you can find all over the internet as well as in the books that those guys kind of produce. And it was fascinating, because I was just thinking this would have been so much use to me if I'd have done it when I was younger, but obviously the internet wasn't there. But the fact is that you can find so much great tutoring for nothing, on there, and so I just dug in with that. And I think the other thing is with the painting side is that I've had the time to kind of like dig in and look at actual painting and all the. I'm not a big necessarily believer in the kind of like the difference between, you know, the visceral kind of like physical painting beyond the exhaustion and sort of like dipping sort of like paintbrushes in your tea or something like that, which are obviously differences and everything like that. But the actual understanding of things like how light hits objects and looking at the kind of economy of style in painting of sort of like people from 19th and 18th century and everything, when they were finding ways to do work faster but without losing any of the realism in their work. Some of the stuff there. So although I'm painting digitally, the things that I'm studying a lot is actual paint. And for me, there's no real difference between the two mediums because the end result is the thing that I'm trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And you're trying to fool a biological eye into believing that what is presented in 2 dimensions is 3 dimensions with natural light hitting it. And that's what I think has happened over the last few years, is that I've had more time to study that and study good examples of that in the area that I'm interested in, obviously, which is that particular type of realism without it being too mannerist.
I mean, it's I think it's a defunct argument myself now that of whether you're kind of the physical nature of painting or the digital nature of painting. Similarly with comics, I mean, that argument I think went fucking, I don't know, 10 years ago or whatever, where people suddenly realised, hey, you know, we can, obviously there's the physical tactile quality of material, and I still work with paper, I still work with other stuff, but you know, all my comics are drawn in Clip Studio, and I don't really care, you know, the idea that I don't have like pages or something, not that people would be rushing to buy them, that's not the point. I think one of the things is amazing, it's brilliant, and if you want to approach it in a kind of, say, an old master style, if you want to approach it in a kind of like areas of study that you still have to look at, because that produces the results. It doesn't matter whether it's in paint or whether it's in pixels, and like you say, light, form, observation.
I think that's it. I mean, it's like, you know, things like anatomy, things like form, things like light, things like movement and motion, but ultimately coming down to in the stuff that I've enjoyed is looking at that kind of economy of brushstrokes to achieve.
So if you were kind of like, say, transposing kind of like a painter to kind of like digital, who at the moment would you be looking at particularly?
Who have I been looking at lately, I suppose? Well, I mean, in terms of sort of like drawing figures, which is obviously the thing that I find the hardest, because it's, you know, it's human anatomy and it can just be all over the place. People like Singer Sargent, you know, I can't seem to fault them, and both for environments and figures, to be fair, with Singer Sargent, you know, I think of him as a portrait painter, but he's so much more. And when you think about his work that he did when he was just out being an artist, rather than the kind of the paid commercial kind of like work that he did as a portrait artist, I mean, some of the stuff is beautiful. And then Zorn as well, for the same kind of like
the Zorn palette,
yeah, but just like the way light, little motes of light striking figures and things like that, you know, that sort of thing.
Do you actually try that with the reduced palette? Have you tried that?
Yes, and you know, maybe I'm just not academically involved enough in it to sort of like fully get it. I think, you know, I am. It's one of those things where that maybe there is a misstep between the physicality of the work that they did and the digital work that I'm doing, in the fact that the ease of production of work digitally is much more immediate, because I'm not having to worry about getting things together and collecting. So maybe there is a step that I'm missing, but ultimately I'm using these people to sort of like try and understand what it is they're looking for in their subjects and how they're trying to achieve what they're doing, like I say, with an economy of brushstrokes. and this is really comes down to, I mean, I'm talking, it sounds highfalutin and everything, and I'm using what I'm learning from these guys who sort of like really kind of like moved that forward to draw up like goblins and sort of like, flying ships and things like that. So
hey, but
at the end of the day,
but they're great rendered ones.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. But like I said, maybe that's it. Maybe the thing to take away from it is something that you probably hear a lot in art schools and everything. It's like, look for the right tutors and everything like that. And I think for me, that kind of 19th and 18th century sort of like art is where I find a lot of my tutoring, if not my inspiration. I mean, I'm a big fan of film and stuff like that, and that's where my inspiration comes from. But then going back to the kind of structure of things and how to sort of like render images, I'm looking at older artists.
And that's absolutely the right thing, because that's been done, and it's not like any time that you have to say, oh, this information has been produced, therefore it's been produced at a certain period of time, so therefore it's irrelevant to my period. It's just it's ridiculous.
I'm not a big fan of that. You can always look to the past.
Of course, it's fantastic. What are you doing? What is it now at the moment you're doing? Or what have you got for the year, or what do you plan to do?
The stuff that's still to come out, I've finished earlier last year, the book 6 of Flintlock, so that'll be coming out.
Jeez, you're on to book 6 now.
Yeah, well, that's done. I mean, that's basically, it feels like it's completing this particular story arc, which is Steve Tanner's book, obviously, and everything, so I'm just the artist on that particular story, and that's been great fun to work on. We're seeing the last couple of weeks of issue 1 of Space Warp out in the public in W.H. Smith's and stuff like that. Wow. So apparently that's done all right. And so I guess we'll get to find out a bit more about what's going forward with that.
Yeah, sure.
In terms of my own books and everything, I've done a little bit of writing, some sketching and everything like that. And we'll see what happens in the new year. But at the minute, I'm in the middle of a lot of TTPRG, sort of like role-playing art, for a science fiction project, as well as fantasy stuff, and I'm producing some of that kind of stuff as well. So as well as doing the museum projects that I've been sort of like working on recently, which have been comics also. We've been looking at sort of like, so my wife obviously being part of the centre of the deaf community locally, being the manager of the deaf centre. I did a project with Barnsley Museums where one of the characters in the book, one of the kid characters, was a BSL user. I'm really interested in sort of like maybe kind of expanding on that as part of something that we could do maybe with the Deaf Centre. So that's certainly something that's been on my mind. I've produced most of the art for a zine, just to talk about, for people to take away for free from there. And I want to do something that's maybe got more local history involved in it as well, and so maybe I'll start having a look at things like that, because I'm fascinated about that. But just linking, so it's not. I'm not really a big fan of like kind of like dry biographies and sort of like just facts and figures and dates. I enjoy the kind of like the symbolism in stuff and linking sort of like ideas to the mythological, linking into the mythological past and stuff like that, because I can't help it. It's just the way my brain works and everything like that. So.
And it's not like that's very far below the surface in anything.
I think that's the case. It's that idea that when we talk about gods like Mercury and Hermes and sort of like being part of sort of like the gods of commerce and sort of like transportation and sort of travel and stuff like that in the distant past, and then you're looking at sort of like the fact that when we say commerce, it's actually got part of the god's name in it, and so like you said, it's not just it's just under the surface in the language that we use every day, and I think that's fascinating to me.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, totally. Wow, that sounds mad. I don't know how to finish this, so we could go on forever. But I think we need to go to the pub, don't we?
Yeah, that seems fair. Let's go.
So I don't think this really matters, but I'll do a thing like, oh, thanks, Gareth. Thanks for taking part in the kind of like exhibition. It's a bit weird because it's an exhibition in a corridor, basically, in a former kind of like office block. So who knows where this is going to lead.
If other people have seen more comics that they like and realise that they're not all the same and that they can be different, then it's done its job.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great way of summing this up, because I think that is one of the things that it doesn't matter who I would invite to take part in this. each person has a kind of their own voice, and it doesn't matter where that voice, what that voice is expressing. And that's one of the kind of like always the wonderful thing about just comics as a kind of like as a visual language. It's just so rich and varied, and even like now as a kind of like geriatric creator, it always surprises me, and long may it continue, I think.
Yeah.
So there we go. Hey comics, there we go. We're gonna go to the pub.